Okay, sweet. Good morning, guys in Cyberland. This is another session that we're coming to you. We've broken the IEP up in sections. Today we will be talking about the accommodations and some things to do for that. We also, Kristen and I will be doing a presentation in Sayre, Woodward, and Weatherford over accommodations. You're more than welcome to sign up for that. If you go to Eventbrite and look for OSDE, you'll see those three places and get signed up for that. Okay, today we're going to do an introduction to accommodations, the accommodation categories, what is a modification, how do we select accommodations, evaluating the effectiveness, and maybe some ideas. We took a 2-hour presentation and I've scrunched it to 30 minutes, so hopefully we will get through it. I just quickly want to go over the definition of an accommodation. Of course, we know that accommodations are changes in how a student accesses information and demonstrates learning. Accommodations do not change the instructional level, the content, or performance criteria. The changes are made in order to provide a student with equal access to learning and an equal opportunity to show what he or she knows and can do. The purpose of an accommodation: accommodations provide the necessary supports to address the student's disability. Accommodation provide access to grade level curriculum. We know we want our special ed students in the gen ed curriculum as much as possible. So what can we do to support them in that way? The learning objectives, expectations are not lowered. Students continue to have high expectations for learning. I was on the phone with the superintendent yesterday discussing this exactly. I look at accommodations as glasses. Some of us have to wear glasses to read, some of us do not. Not everybody needs accommodations, but those of who do, they need it to help support. When I put my glasses on, I don't get a different passage than everyone else. I'm reading the same exact thing. It's just I need my glasses to help support me. Otherwise, I can't read it. I love this picture about equality versus equity. For a fair selection, everybody has to take the same exam. Please climb that tree, which is fine for our monkey, but for our seal friend, our elephant, and maybe our fish, they couldn't climb the tree. Does that make it that they don't know what a tree is or that they can't swim fast? No, it just means if we're completely judging them on that specific part, we need to make sure we're equal in that. What do accommodations do? Accommodations and procedures that provide equitable access during instruction and assessment for students with disabilities. Like I said, we want to make sure we want them in the gen ed curriculum. That's what we want them to be studying. And I know you're all thinking, that's all well and good, Shawna, but I have an 8th grader who reads on a 1st grade level, and I say yes, absolutely. But that 8th grader is tested on 8th grade material. It's not tested on 1st grade material. So you want to make sure that you are providing instruction and access to that, and you may need to do accommodations or things or services in place to help support him. It's intended to reduce or even eliminate the effects of a student's disability. We do not want to reduce our learning expectations. That's the key point with accommodations. We're not trying to make it easier for them or make sure they always get an A or make sure we want to just put in place things that can help support them and keep our expectations high. But we don't want them to fail, so we don't want to, just throw them into the deep water. That's why we accommodate. That's why we need to accommodate. And they must be consistent across classroom instruction, classroom assessments, district-wide assessments, and statewide assessments. And we'll talk more about that in a minute. Our framework for accommodations, of course, like I said, we want to make sure you set high expectations for students with disabilities. This, to me, is a good conversation for our gen ed teachers. You can tell them that you want to keep the expectations high. We want to learn about the accommodations for instruction and assessments. You want to make sure you select appropriate accommodations for instruction and assessments for the individual students. Effectively administer accommodations during instructions and assessments. And absolutely, we want to evaluate the effectiveness of accommodations. If they're not working, stop putting them on the IEP. Change them. Do different accommodations for that student. Of course, accommodations come in 4 categories. These are the most ones we see: timing, scheduling, response, presentation. A student can receive an accommodation in one or all of these methods. It just depends on that student's needs. For setting, the setting accommodations changes the location or the conditions of the setting in which a student receives instruction and participates in an assessment. Maybe we put student may be allowed to sit in a different location when the majority of the students, in order to reduce distractions or increase access to assistive technology. Setting can be, it's not limited to that. Maybe we have special lighting that the student needs, acoustics, sensory tools, anything like that. Oh, there we go. Selected accommodations should be very specific. We see this all the time, preferential seating. Well, what does that mean? It means he gets to pick whatever he wants whenever he wants? No. Johnny likes to sit at the back of the room. Students with ADD, ADHD, I always put them on the outskirts of a room. You're not going to put me in a meeting in the dead center of a room. I probably will cause a distraction, wiggling and fidgeting. So you want to be specific on the IEP. Don't just put special seating or preferential, thank you, Destiny, seating. If you don't say by the teacher or across the room, facing the wall, middle of the second row, if that student moves or changes teachers, they're not going to know what you meant by that. And I'll show you on the IEP how to be very, very specific when we're talking about some of these accommodations. These are classroom accommodations, timing and scheduling of accommodations. It changes the allowable length of time or needed breaks to complete an assignment or activity. Timing accommodations may also change the way the time is organized. If you see Johnny takes his medicine in the morning and by afternoon it wears off, so I probably wouldn't put Johnny's hard classes in the afternoon if that's when his medicine's wearing off. Maybe I want him to do his testing in the morning, or maybe I need him to do testing right after lunch. That's where you can be very specific. It may be types of day. Maybe I tell his teachers, please don't give him all of his tests on Monday or Fridays, or right after he comes back from a certain parent's house. These are all things you can change for a student to help them be successful. They're still taking the same test. They're doing the same work. We just may have to adjust when. A particular student is very slow at completing assignments. The student is very capable of completing the assignment, but he cannot keep up with the pace of the other students. So the team would like to meet and establish how much time is sufficient for the student to finish the end of an academic school day, 1 additional day, 2 additional days. I would be very, very careful with your middle school and high school. They can be pretty rigid. They have to get their grades in on a certain time. So you don't want to give it open-ended. Johnny will have extra time. Well, to me, that means he has open-ended whenever he turns it in, 1 year, 2 years from now. So you want to make sure you're specific. No, he gets 1 extra day or 2 extra days. This also helps with your gen ed teachers to be more willing to kind of buy into the accommodations when you're talking to them, what works in your classroom. They don't want you to say, Johnny gets as much time ever needed, which could be 5 months from now, to complete an assignment. So actually have talks with your gen ed teachers as well about what's a good timeline for them before you say Johnny gets, the end of the semester to turn in all of his work. If that's what that student needs, then let's put it in there, but make sure everyone, all people on the IEP team, all gen ed teachers understand what you mean by that. Response accommodations allows the students to complete the assignment and test activities in a different way. Maybe you have a student who struggles with writing, so he uses a computer or iPad to type his response. I had a student who, if you erased something, he thought it was broken, and we would have meltdowns. So he had tiles, ABC tiles. He would touch the tiles, and the para would circle the answer for him. That way, that would cut down on stress. Was it more consuming for us? Yes. Did we have to make sure we managed our time with the gen ed teachers and with me to get that done? Yes. But it was for the best, and Johnny was very successful with that. Presentation is also another one. That accommodation provides students to access instruction and assessments in different formats other than reading standard print, maybe auditory, tactile, visual, a combination of both. If you have a student who's struggling with reading, maybe he reads the book, then he listens to the book on tape, then he listens and follows along. Maybe you have a student who struggles with visual issues. Maybe we need to blow up the print. Some students, white lights and white paper are very daunting on their eyes, so maybe we have to do his assignments on blue paper or different colored paper, anything like that. Just make sure, guys, my special ed friends out there, if you put it in the IEP, please make sure you're talking to your gen ed teachers, principals, and explaining to them why you chose it or why the team feels it's necessary. Don't just put it on the IEP and then walk away from it, because no one will understand exactly what you mean by it. Now we want to talk about the difference between accommodation and modifications. A lot of times they try to exchange these words, and they're very different. We said accommodations do not reduce learning expectations, but rather provide a student with access to the gen ed curriculum. Our modifications is what does change and lower or reduce learning expectations. In addition, they increase the gap between achievement of the student with disabilities and expectations for proficiency at grade level. My friend Johnny, who's an 8th grader who reads on a 1st grade level, if I only always give him 1st grade work or kindergarten level work, then how am I going to start closing that gap? So there's a huge fine line actually between when is it accommodating and when are we modifying. And for modification, really, there's only a small population you really should be modifying for, which is fine. And if your student needs that to be successful, we're not saying you don't choose that. We're just saying be mindful of choosing modifications all the time, because it changes in what a student is expected to learn. The changes are made to provide a student with opportunities to participate with the other students in the classroom. So I may have a student who is in the severe profound classroom, So I want him to make sure he participates with his gen ed population for something. But obviously, he cannot do this certain writing activity, so he may get a ABC order or cut and paste, something different, but he's still in there with his gen ed population. So you want to make sure you are very mindful when you're talking about that in the IEP meeting as a team. Examples of modifications, of course, it's reducing the assignment and assessment to a student only that needs to complete the easiest problems or items. Revising assignments or assessments to make them easier. Crossing out half of the responses all the time where they only have 2 to choose from. So to me, is that really asking if Johnny knows what the questions are, or is he good guessing because he only has 2 to choose from? Giving a student hints or clues to correct responses on assessments and tests. And I know you guys, I've been a special ed teacher. It's very easy for us to want to help them and make sure they're successful, but you also don't want to help them all the time where it hinders them and they start using it as a crutch, because we know the real world does not modify for me. Otherwise, I would have been the billionaire winner for the lotto. So we want to prepare our students for that. Modification Summary. Of course, modifications change the learning expectations. Only a small % of our special ed population require modifications, and be very, very selective when you're using your modifications. When we're selecting an accommodation, of course, is part of the development of the IEP. You want to make sure you're looking at what's the student's learning strengths and needs. Use those when choosing accommodations. How do the student's learning needs affect the achievement of the grade level content standards? And what specialized instruction does the student need to achieve the grade level content standards? So during the IEP meeting, you want to make sure you're having these conversations with the gen ed teachers, with mom. Everyone's on the same page so we understand exactly why or what's needed for an accommodation. On accommodations, you want to practice how you play. What I mean by that, for my sports fans out there, is we get this all the time. I'm going to put this on the IEP just in case he needs it for the state test. No, we're not going to put stuff on there just in case they need it. You put it on there because they do need it. And if they need it on the state test, they need to be practicing it throughout the school year, throughout all of his classes. And I know I get this a lot, but he needs it on the state test. He doesn't need it in the gen ed or in the classroom. Then I would tell you he don't need it on the state test if he doesn't need it all year long before the state test. When you're making accommodation decisions, please remember all students are different. I get this a lot. Oh, I use these accommodations for my whole caseload. No, you don't. I want you to start looking. Not every student needs that accommodation. If they do, fabulous, put it on there. But I want you to be more mindful about not every student on my caseload needs these accommodations. It's about what the individual student needs to be successful. And an accommodation that works for one student may not work for another with the same need. And of course, in Ed Plan, these are what it looks like when you print it. Just remember, in the classroom, we can go above and beyond. Of course, in the state testing, we only have a certain to choose from. This is where I was talking about in Ed Plan when I was talking about being very, very specific about our accommodations. You can choose the other button in Ed Plan, and then you can be very, very specific. Johnny does better when he takes his test in the afternoon. Johnny needs to sit by the door towards the back. Please don't set Johnny by a window. be very specific with your accommodations here on this tab. When we're considering our accommodations, we want to choose which accommodations are used regularly on classroom versus test. What's the accommodation effectiveness? Student, teacher, parents, get each one of these to buy in. For my middle school and high school teachers, ask the student, do you like this accommodation? A lot of them will say, no, I don't want to be pulled out. It's embarrassing. You know, don't do this for me. So be mindful of that for our students. They have a voice too. Teachers, talk to your gen ed teachers. What's some issues with implementing this accommodation? Are you having issues? Are you seeing that he doesn't need this as often? And then you may need to meet and revise the IEP. Have there been any difficulties with the accommodation? Really make sure you're listening to your gen ed teachers. And of course, when we're implementing the accommodation, you want to monitor and find out if it's working. If a student is starting to soar and, you know, making straight A's, everything's great, you may want to check his accommodations and pull back and see if he can do it on his own. Have those conversations. Don't also get into a habit of just because Johnny needed an accommodation in pre-K, we just keep it checked first, second, third, all the way up to 12th grade. You want to be mindful. You need to be looking at those annually as well when you have the IEP meeting. If an accommodation isn't working, he never uses it, doesn't need it, take it off. Then if things start happening and he starts failing, starts struggling, then you may want to look about putting it back in. Accommodations in all environments. If you see an accommodation that is working great for a student, then talk to the parents at home, talk to his work, maybe have him self-advocate for himself about what accommodations are working for him or her. Accommodations, these are just some accommodations you can try. Like I said, this isn't everything. Break down your assignments. If you have a student who struggles, maybe he does the first 10 or every other one, mark out the first 5. Talk with the student about that. Reduce homework assignments. If you have a student who homework is hard, maybe we put some time at the end of the day where he does his homework at school. Giving choices is always great, especially our students with behavior issues. Do you want to do evens or odds? Do you want to do the first 5, skip 5, then do another 5? Is it harder for you guys to grade? Yes. I'm not going to lie to you. But to me, in the long run, if that makes them be successful and they're turning in work, then okay, I'll take it and we'll figure out our grading later. You want to make sure you're very concrete when describing new concepts and abstract material, especially for our children on the autism spectrum, and you may need to put that in the accommodation in that specific tab. A lot of times they get lost in maybe idioms, or if a teacher talks in very abstract language, you may need to put that. Johnny does better with very concrete instructions. Some ideas, maybe some students need a daily schedule. Put that in there. Let them know this is what's working for him. Everything can be a social skill. Maybe you have a student with social issues. Maybe you need to put something in his accommodations about that. Sometimes we forget. We only focus on academics, which is great. But think outside the box with some of our issues, or some of our students and some of their issues. Remember the classroom setup. You can have that. That can be an accommodation. It may not be something you put in the IEP. It may be something you talk to a teacher about. Hey, have a peace corner for a teacher or for students. Maybe they need brain breaks, stickers, music, things like that. Organizing your environment. If you have a student who does well with a break card, the first and then, maybe you need a student who needs visual supports for procedures and routines. Those are something you would put in the IEP. Johnny does really good with visual supports. He needs a picture schedule so he knows exactly what's going to take place. First and then, first you put, you tidy up, or first you put your name on the paper. Then I'll give you a 5-minute break. First you turn in, 5 problems, then you get a break. Things like that. Those are all things you can use in your classroom. Accommodations in conclusion are chosen for the individual student, their needs, and should be specifically geared towards that student's specific needs. If an accommodation is chosen for a test, make sure we're practicing it in the classroom. Do not over-accommodate. It's not the amount of accommodations you choose, it's the quality of the accommodations you choose. It's very hard for gen ed teachers if you click every single accommodation for every single child that you have. It's hard for everyone to keep that straight and implement them. Now, if a student needs every specific accommodation, then put it on there. But just be mindful. Does he really need it? Yes. Then put it on there. This is just a reminder, too, for our state testing. Here's the link for the Accommodation Manual that you can have that's very easy to follow along when you're choosing accommodations. And there's my bird. I love him. And as always, here is our number. If you have any questions, please feel free to call us, and one of the AAs will send you to the right person. Also, like I said, this is the very short, fast version of accommodations. If you want the longer version, please feel free to go to Eventbrite and look, and you're more than welcome to attend. And I think I literally have 1 minute left if there's any quick questions. I lost the little timer thing. I don't know what I did with it. Good, no questions. Okay, well, if you have any questions, like I said, you can always call us and we will answer your questions. Have a fabulous day.